Yeah, well, happy Earth Day Eve. It's tomorrow. And we'll, again, I hope you learn how important it is to respect our environment after this presentation. And this is to discuss how food and climate change are linked. Can everyone see the screen with the food climate change nexus on it?
No, I'm just seeing you.
Okay, let me see.
I'm not seeing a PowerPoint.
Okay, hang on there.
There
Okay, there we go.
You see it? Okay.
Yep, that's it.
All right. Anyways, one reason that Ellie Taylor and I, who are part of the environmental working group for the South Carolina League, we picked this issue because we wanted to find a way that anyone can contribute, contribute to the effort towards lowering their personal carbon footprint. I think a lot of people are under the impression that, that once the utilities go with renewable energy and we get electric cars and we turn lights off when we leave the room, that everything should be fine. But that's not the case. And after this program, I hope that the takeaway is that you develop a culture of sustainability and that you start being aware of things that you can do to be more sustainable. Before we get into the details, we're going to have some background information that's pertinent to to this issue. There's three unsettling goals, global trends that are important to understand why food is such a critical piece of the climate puzzle. The first unsettling trend is global population. We just exceeded 8 billion people in 2022. And according to the United Nations, they project that the global population will be 10.5 billion in about 60 years. That's a 30% increase. I think that, we here in the upstate or in South Carolina are kind of in a bubble and that, we don't really feel the global impacts, but you go to some countries and it's very acute. One thing I'd like for you to consider is people that are born today, they have a good chance of living to the year 2100. That's just 77 years from now. And imagine what a person that's born today will experience in the year 2100. They will experience this amount of increase in global population. As far as atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations, this is a graph of the last 800,000 years. This is all based on ice core data. And I've updated this graph. The highest modern day atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations was 420 part per million, and that was just 5 months ago. And as you can see, it's off the charts. And what that is showing is that basically it's been over 1 million years since atmospheric concentrations have been this high. Second unsettling trend is food vulnerability. Of course, David Beasley, the former South Carolina governor, he's head of the World Food Program. And the information I got off their website is in the upper left is the shows where countries where food vulnerability is more acute than others. And clearly they're in Western Africa and so forth, it's bad. And then down on the lower right, less than about 60 years from now, it shows the projected food vulnerability attributed to climate change. And one of the takeaways of this is that climate change is going to make those areas that are already food vulnerable even more vulnerable. This is a, go ahead.
Do we know why it's more concentrated in Africa than other continents?
Why the impact of global warming?
Yes.
Yeah, there's different factors, and I'm not aware of the details, but basically the modeling, so forth, that they do, they, you know, of course, the models are always being developed, but those models kind of show what the combined impact between, you know, increasing temperatures and sea level rise and so forth will, how it will affect different areas. And you know, some areas will experience relatively minor changes where some other areas will be much greater changes. And again, I don't know the specifics of why Africa will be more impacted than any other country, but it's not unusual to consider that some countries will be more impacted than others. This is one example where that's the case, and that and this I'm sure factors into it, is this figure here shows 4 of the world's most productive rice producing regions. These regions, you know, a lot of the third world countries, their staple food is rice. And without rice, you know, they would, you know, have a hard time, you know, with their food supply. And these 4 areas are at within 25 feet above sea level today. And so they're vulnerable to sea level rise. And so if these areas are impacted by sea level rise, then clearly the rice production will be impacted. And then again, those people will have a source of food that they're relying upon today that might not be there. So that's part of the reason some of these third world countries are going to be more impacted than others. This is the Mekong Delta in Vietnam, and it's projected to be underwater by 2100. The reason it is it's not just sea level rise, but there's also subsidence of the land, because the farmers on the Mekong Delta extract groundwater to water their rice fields. And when they withdraw the groundwater at the rate that they're withdrawing it, there's subsidence of the land, and you combine that with sea level rise, and basically half of this important rice producing country or region of Vietnam is going to be underwater. So clearly, again, their food supply will be from this area won't exist. Plus, those people will be displaced. And so, you know, that's going to have its own impacts. The other issues pertaining to food insecurity, you know, we just went through the coronavirus. You know, who knows if there might be some future pandemic. And then, you know, supply chain issues. You know, this is shows where that freighter got jammed into the Suez Canal and blocked traffic through the Suez Canal for several days. Another issue where reason food becomes more vulnerable is because of, you know, geopolitical matters where, you know, there's embargoes and that sort of thing. Now, historically, our response to food scarcity is to say, well, we just need to grow more food. And unfortunately, that exacerbates climate change in a serious way. Clearly, you know, in the South, if we have a food source that is no longer available and we say we need to grow more food, that means we're going to have to produce farmland where it doesn't exist today. And typically that's at the expense of some undeveloped wilderness area. So that means cutting down those trees, which are essential for sequestering carbon. And so just cutting down the trees is bad enough, but then, the agriculture process on this newly developed farmland also contributes. You'll see in a minute how it contributes to greenhouse gas emissions. We'll talk briefly. The carbon dioxide is one of the greenhouse gases that everyone's aware of. This shows that, once it's emitted to the atmosphere, it's basically in the atmosphere for a couple of hundred years. It is the reference greenhouse gas against which all other greenhouse gases are compared. If we look at methane, it's also a greenhouse gas, and it doesn't stay in the atmosphere as long as carbon dioxide. And the reason why is if you look at the equation down in the lower left-hand corner, methane is oxidized into carbon dioxide. So methane emissions are just future carbon dioxide emissions. The bad thing about methane is their global warming potential of methane is 25 times that of carbon dioxide. So 1 metric ton of methane emissions is equal to 25 metric tons of carbon dioxide emissions. Primary sources of methane are shown here. As you can see, enteric fermentation and manure management are agricultural matters that contribute, approximately 35% of all the total methane emissions. As far as the enteric fermentation, they're referring to methane emissions associated with lamb and cattle and so forth. And, this is one of those things I learned I didn't realize, but cattle emit a tremendous amount of methane. So you think of what it takes to raise, a cow before it's processed, it might be 4 or 5 years. And so that every day it's generating methane. And then, of course, manure management associated with, meat production. There's a lot of methane emissions associated with that. The third source of methane is from landfills. Now, this is only partially associated with our food. The reason I bring this up, though, is because food disposal to our landfills is such a significant waste stream. According to the USDA, 30 to 40% of the U.S. food supply is wasted. The reason we're able to waste that amount of food is because the U.S. is in control of many of the corporate farms and so forth. They produce a tremendous amount of food, and I guess you can give them credit for producing that amount of food, but because we have so much abundance, we don't think twice about wasting it. As far as wasted food, again, most of it goes to landfills, and that's a serious problem because of the methane emissions. It says 21% of the municipal solid waste generated in the U.S. is food waste. So if 21% of the municipal landfill garbage is received is food waste, then a substantial portion of that methane generated by landfills can be attributed to food. According to the Twin Chimneys website, in 2015, there's over 600,000 tons of food waste landfilled in South Carolina. This is I got this off the Twin Chimneys website, and this is the data for their greenhouse gas emissions This is for 2021. And of course, the graph in the middle shows the cumulative emissions expressed in metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalents from year 2010 to year 2021. That's 11 years. The cumulative emissions, if you add all this up, is right around 1.5 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalents. And that's just the landfill that we use. That, of course, there's thousands of landfills across the United States and probably millions if you go across, throughout the world. There's many landfills that have closed, no longer in use, but they're still emitting methane. In 2021, the metric tons of CO2 emitted was close to 140,000 metric tons. As you can see, methane was a substantial part of that. So one of the takeaways from this presentation, I hope you'll realize that we need to manage our food waste responsibly. It's better to divert your food waste to compost if that's available to you, because it produces CO2 emissions, not methane, like it would if it were in the landfill. Also, by diverting your food waste away from the landfill and composting it, you don't take up landfill space. It's better used for other waste materials.
Ted, can I ask you a question?
Sure.
I have a compost service that I signed up for a couple of years ago,
Okay.
and they do like a high heat processing of compost. So supposedly, but I was just wondering if like the high heat part of it sort of negates the benefit of doing the compost. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I'm not quite sure what that high heat is referring to. I know that compost, when you create a huge amount of organic matter and pile it up, that the inside can get quite warm because of the microbial degradation. And so I'm wondering, I'll have to look that up and get back with you on that. If that's an internal process, meaning it's, that they might insulate that compost in a way that it's generating the heat as a part of the decomposition process, or it could be, as what you're suggesting, it could be an external process where you're adding heat to it. And I don't know which, I suspect the first way is that, that the heat generated as a product of the decomposition, I suspect is what they're talking about, and that they might just insulate it such that it, it's higher temperature and decomposes faster. But I'll have to look at that. And
Yeah,
unless
they say it's hot enough that it kills like weeds and stuff like that.
Uh-huh.
But I don't know.
Yeah, if you could send me that compost company, and I'll look them up and I'll find out and see what they're talking about.
Yeah, I think it's called Compost House. They do a pickup service.
That's awesome.
But you can have it every week or like every other week. I don't need it, but every other week.
Okay.
But and they'll give you back the compost. But when I got back the compost, to me, it didn't look like really rich compost. You know what I mean? It looked more ashy. So I don't know. I was thinking about worms getting a
Yeah. Well, clearly, as you're suggesting, if it is an external process where they're adding, heating it up, then that certainly would add to the carbon footprint of that process. And so, but I'll look that up for you and get back to you.
Okay.
The processed compost, though, typically is applied to agricultural fields and gardens. And one benefit of that is that the carbon in that compost is now sequestered in the soil. So it's not, if it becomes integral to the soil, like, taken up by plants and so forth, then it's not, it's not emitted into the atmosphere directly. And it also provides a source of nutrients. And that brings a different way of managing food waste is you can put it in an anaerobic digester and generate methane that is then used as an alternative source of energy. And in this case, this is the one at Disney World where they take all the food waste generated in their, in the park, and they process it through these anaerobic digesters with the goal of creating methane. And that methane in turn is used as energy to run the park. Now, the third greenhouse gas that we'll talk about is nitrous oxide. And its residence time in the atmosphere is a little over 100 years. But if you notice, the most serious thing about nitrous oxide is its greenhouse global warming potential, in that it, 1 metric ton of nitrous oxide is the same as emitting 265 tons of carbon dioxide. So it's a much more efficient at trapping heat. When it comes to nitrous oxide emissions, agriculture is the primary source of nitrous oxide emissions, and that's associated with fertilization of soil and so forth, as well as, again, manure management. So when we say, well, let's just grow more food, what we're really saying is we're going to be generating more greenhouse gas emissions. And of course, the major source of the nitrous oxide is, associated with the production of fertilizer, as well as the over application of fertilizer. And so I've heard that, they're starting to get innovative in like using drones and things to apply fertilizers and pesticides and so forth, so that there's not so much over application as opposed to like crop dusters and things like that. Now we'll get into how our diet can influence climate change. This table here shows the carbon dioxide equivalents per pound of produce, as well as the carbon dioxide equivalents per pound of bone-free meat. Of course, the foods listed in green are vegetables and fruits, and those in red are meats. And it's no surprise that the fruits and vegetables generate a lot less carbon dioxide emission equivalents than the meats. But what you need to take away from this is that, lamb and beef, what we talked about previously about their methane emissions, as well as when you think about it, all these, grains and so forth are necessary to raise, beef cattle and dairy and so forth. So basically, the carbon associated with growing these the grains and so forth is also contributes to is input to the beef CO2 footprint. And if you can see, a pound of beef is much more seriously impacts climate change than would a pound of fruits and vegetables. I'm not a vegetarian or a vegan, but since I've learned this, I've eaten a lot less meat, and particularly beef. It's not that I never eat a steak anymore, but it's few and far between. And that's part of what I hope to get across to everyone that sees this presentation, is that they don't necessarily have to give it up, but they should be aware that sometimes picking a food source or a food group that's less impactful on the climate associated with climate change is better than going to your beef. One thing that we can do to reduce our food waste is know what these food date labels mean. And I recommend you go to a reputable source like the USDA and understand whether these food date labels, whether it means that the food is going bad or if it's just not optimal. A lot of times, in most cases, the food used by date or is just a recommendation, for optimal conditions of that particular food. Another thing is you need to shop smart and don't buy more than what you're probably going to be able to consume, in your household. Because how it is, a lot of times you buy too much and it goes bad, and next thing you know, it's in the garbage. Another thing is don't be a perfectionist, in that a lot of foods that aren't necessarily perfect in how they appear doesn't mean that they're still not edible and nutritious. So if you unfortunately, a lot of these types of foods at grocery chains, Publix and so forth, they're already culled out of the group and thrown away. But if you see, some bananas that might be, not look as great as others, but they're still perfectly taste what good and not gone bad, then I'll buy those instead of the ones that look perfect, and just make sure I eat them before they go bad. All fruits and vegetables, not all, I won't say all of them, but most of them emit an ethylene gas, and that's part of their ripening process. And if there's a fruit or vegetable that's emitting ethylene gas after you bring it home and you store it next to another fruit or vegetable, that ethylene gas, the presence of it, will cause other foods to ripen more quickly. And so, if that's the case, then you might want to separate your fruits and vegetables where they're stored so that they don't influence each other.
Mm-hmm.
Then, of course, clearly, if you got a cluttered refrigerator, you're going to find something a couple of weeks down the road where it's gone bad and you throw it out. I love my leftovers. I like the leftovers a lot of times better than the day that it's fixed. Of course, a lot of people, cut the skins off apples, chicken, cucumbers and so forth. And a lot of times that's where the nutrients are located anyway. But again, that's just food waste. That doesn't necessarily have to be waste if you can tolerate eating the skins of these fruits and vegetables. Of course, moderate your serving size, because obviously if someone doesn't clean their plate, then whatever's left over ends up being food waste. And then it's good to try to preserve foods if you're a lot of people are into that. Some aren't, but if you got enough, it's good to try to preserve it to keep it from going bad. As far as our food sources, this is incredibly important. This is photographs of California, and they experienced years long, number of years of drought, and it impacted a lot of the areas where they're agricultural regions. Then it turned around, and they most recently have experienced this atmospheric rivers where the area is flooding. It's almost epic flooding. And so the reason I bring this to your attention is because, can we rely on food from the sources that are distant from South Carolina. What if this were to happen in an area where avocados are grown, or coffee's grown, or bananas or kiwi fruit? What's happening in that part of the world where foods that we rely upon, distant locations, if in the future, if they're more impacted by climate change, then they may not be available. And for that reason, it's important that we have, again, a sustainability culture and mindset where we say we need to start thinking about making sure that we have food closer to home. And literally, it'd be great for those that have the backyard or land available to grow their own food. It's a worthwhile endeavor on a number of levels. But for, not everybody can have a garden, but you can certainly look for ways to identify local farmers and buy their produce. We of course want to support our local farmers, particularly those that are certified organic farmers, and that they're trying harder to minimize their particular impact on the environment. And so it's, of course, we've got these corporate farmers that are monoculture that, their impact on the climate is pretty serious. But, there are those local farmers and certified farmers that are in the area that, it's good to encourage that type of responsibility in growing food. And then the same goes with seafood. And then there's vegetable-based meat substitutes. And be honest, I've not tried these yet, but the people that I've talked to that have tried these different products have had good things to say about it, saying that basically, in some cases they say, well, I like it better. Another long-term goal is it would be really important if the food we get, if it's labeled with the carbon footprint. Clearly a certified organic farm product would have a lower carbon footprint than would a corporate based product. And then lastly, as far as land policy, again, it goes back to, can we really rely on sources of food that are, hundreds and thousands of miles away? And in the future, with food scarcity becoming more acute, with the population growth, with the worsening climate, conditions, we'll find that, we might not be able to rely on distant sources of food. And if that's the case, then we're crazy for taking local farms and saying, well, that's a great place to put a subdivision. Let's, buy up that farm and develop it. Once this farm goes away, then whatever food that it generated, it becomes a food deficit, and that's got to be made up somewhere. And that's usually at some third world country in an undeveloped area where they, whether it's the local people or the corporate farmers, they'll clear that area off and create farmland. And so, groups like Upstate Forever and so forth, it's important to support them so that, we preserve local farms, because they're going to become more important in the future. And so, basically, hopefully the takeaway here is that there's a number of things you can do starting today to lower your personal carbon footprint. And that's again, modify what you eat. In my case, I eat less beef and more fruits and vegetables. Be aware of what happens when you throw food in the garbage. I put as much food as I can in the garbage disposal instead of the trash. And then I've got a garden out back, and all the coffee grounds and all the food waste that we generate, it goes into the garden. And then consider again better alternatives for managing food waste. If you do have option to go to compost, that's great. But in the future, hopefully we can have anaerobic digesters that produce this alternative source of fuel, biofuel, and hopefully in the future we'll be able to segregate our waste disposal such that food waste does go to manufacturing of alternative energy. That will occur eventually in the future. And then, of course, be mindful of the source of where you get your food, And that concludes the presentation.
Well, Ted, have you ever heard of a place called Black Sheep Market?
No.
This little guy opened up this butcher shop over in Hampton, near where the old Kmart used to be.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Sort of across the street, if you know where the fire station is, a little bit up from that old Kmart. Anyway, his beef and chicken and pork, everything that he sells there is locally sourced.
Mm-hmm.
And it is so much better. I mean, the taste is amazing. If you do want to have that steak.
Yeah. Well,
I mean, that's what I like. I don't buy my beef I don't buy that much beef anyway, but I don't cook that much beef. I don't cook that much meat, but
mm-hmm. Yeah, well, see this is what I hope that you take away from this, is that you share that type of information for the purpose of hoping that people will reduce their carbon footprint by buying local.
Right.
Because the thing is when you buy local, when you factor in all the transportation associated with transporting food from hundreds and thousands of miles away, and the packaging and so forth, that your carbon footprint is a lot bigger when you're buying from Brazil and so forth compared to buying local. It's a lot. It makes a huge difference. And so what I hope that people on this call do is they share this information and talk to people about, I'd rather put my food waste in the garbage disposal where it goes to Rewall and it's processed that way, as opposed to going to a landfill. Or take this and food waste and just if you not everybody's got this option, but if they got a garden or house or plants outside that can benefit from that compost, I just put the food waste in our garden and just turn the soil over and just let it decompose in the soil directly. So
do you know whether or not oat milk is sustainable?
Oat milk?
Option? Yeah.
I would say it is, if it's genuinely made from oats, I've never heard of that. Actually, I've heard of like almond milk.
Yeah, I don't like almond milk, but I love oat milk. If you haven't tried it,
I'll have to look into that. But yes, I've not seen the numbers, but you can't help but think that oat milk, because it's being generated plant-based, that its carbon footprint is going to be quite a bit less than the carbon footprint associated with raising dairy cattle.
Yeah, or even raising
So
almonds.
I think it's a good guess to say that oat milk is probably quite a few times, lower carbon footprint than dairy milk. And I've got a paper where I got that information from. So if there's anybody that wants to look up a particular type of food or how those numbers were generated and so forth, I can provide you with that.
I was just really surprised at how much less pork was than beef.
Yeah, and I think it has to do with a lot of it has to do with their digestive process, and that there's the multiple stomachs in the cow and that sort of thing, versus pork, which they're not, their digestive process apparently is quite a bit different.
Okay.
Plus it might not take as long. I'm not an expert in this, but I suspect that part of the reason is for pork to mature for harvesting, it might not take as long.
Yeah.
Clearly the longer it takes, that means more greenhouse gases emissions that are generated.
Well, thank you.
But
It's terrifying. So,
yeah, well, again, I think it's like I have 3 grandchildren now. They're all under the age of 6, and it's just so frightening to me to think of what's it going to be like when they're 66.
yeah.
With the population growth and the climate change and this, that, and the others, it's not going to be great. And so, as far as I'm concerned, a lot of people are saying, "Oh, you're going to retire," and this, that, and the other. And it's like, how can I, with good conscience, just simply retire and say, well, I've done my thing. That's kind of drift off in a personal thing, but that's my outlook, is that while I'm productive, I want to make an effort to make things better
Right.
for future generations.
Right.
And hopefully people, once they become more aware of how acute this issue is, that they also will generate a mindset to where, politically and so forth, will finally align and start taking climate change much more serious in the United States.
Ted, I don't know if you see that Judith has her hand up.
Oh, I'm sorry. Thanks for, let's see, find the chat here. Well, oh, okay. I thought you'd be in the chat. Yeah, Judith, what, you have a question?
I do have a question, and that is, once in one of your past lectures, you discussed the reasons why it was better to put the food through the garbage disposal than in the trash. And I found that so amazing. Would you reiterate the reasons?
Yeah. If it goes in the trash, then it goes into a landfill. And what happens in the landfill is that the microorganisms there, where there's oxygen, when there's decomposition, it generates carbon dioxide. But that oxygen is quickly depleted because there's so much food waste and so forth, to where it goes anoxic, and those microorganisms generate methane. And if you remember in the presentation, methane is 25 times more effective at trapping greenhouse gases than carbon dioxide, and that methane will eventually turn into carbon dioxide anyway. So it's much better to convert methane to carbon dioxide. And one way to do that is if you take your food waste and send it to the garbage disposal, it will go to the wastewater treatment plant. And that wastewater treatment plant, of course, depending on the way, there's primary, secondary, tertiary waste management processes associated with the wastewater treatment plant. But what will happen is that will serve as food for the biological processes in that wastewater treatment plant. And what happens is that's done in the presence of oxygen. And so that means when those microorganisms decompose the waste, the organic waste is processed through the waste treatment plant, it generates carbon dioxide. And so that's the reason it's better to go to the garbage disposal than throwing it away in the trash.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Now, if you go and look into that further, there's also some anaerobic digestion that occurs in wastewater treatment plants, but a lot of times they capture that methane and do something with it. So, you know, if you see reference to methane in wastewater treatment, you know, generally they're doing something to burn that methane.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'm going to be talking about sea level rise at the convention next Saturday. And as part of this environmental working group, I'll be presenting that sea level rise presentation as, you know, sometime in the future when we do the environmental working group Zoom meeting. And so if you're interested in that, you know, let me know. Of
Ted,
course,
it's Susan. I have a question.
Sure.
Is there any work around capturing the methane from landfills and actually creating an energy source from that?
Yes. Like the Twin Chimneys, they have, you know, because it's a new modern landfill, they're going to have a methane system, a methane capture system. And what happens is when they cap that landfill with clay, it's to keep gases like methane from coming out. And what it is it goes out, you know, they allow that gas when it's generated to go to a methane capture system, and they do reuse that. You know, they try to reuse that as an alternative source of energy for some, or they burn it off. They just flare it. The problem is that these landfill cells, you know, they might be a number of acres and they might remain open for, you know, couple, 3 or 4 or 5 years while they're filling up that particular cell, and it's not capped. And, you know, and until they cap it, they can't really capture it.
Okay.
So all the waste that's been buried over months and months and months of garbage disposal, it goes anoxic, and that decomposition process generates that methane, and there's no cap to contain it, and it's you know, it goes out just directly into the atmosphere. Now, once they cap it, they got a good chance of capturing it, but they'll capture most of it, but they're probably not going to capture all of it.
Okay. That's helpful. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. But again, you know, glad that everyone was able to attend, and hope that everyone learned something new. And if you're interested in learning more about different environmental issues, encourage you to join our environmental working group. Judith Kramer, she's active participant in our environmental working group. And next month, we got a gentleman, Seth Pritchard. He's a professor at College of Charleston. He's going to talk about sustainable agriculture. And so we'll try to have speakers on different environmental issues at every environmental working group meeting. And so, it won't just all be climate change. There's different issues going on. And, we'll try to bring on someone that's a credible person in the particular area that we're interested in, and have them enlighten us about different environmental matters. So if you're interested in that, my email is tvolskay, as in Ted, VOLSKAY @gmail.com. And if you're not participating in the environmental working group, then give me an email, and I'll put you on the distribution list of notification of when we have meetings.
Great.
And they're usually on about typically the third Thursday of the month, every other month, from 5:30 to 6:30 is when we've been having it.
Is it Zoom or live?
Yes, it's Zoom.
Okay. Great. Well, thanks for your presentation today, Ted. Were there any other questions or comments?
Very eye-opening, and appreciate all the useful tips. So thank you for that.
Yeah, no, I mean, I feel kind of, I've been an environmental consultant for over 30 years, and I didn't really appreciate how big of a problem this is until I started, focusing on that. And, now that I'm aware of it, I'm almost embarrassed to say that, those 30 years, I just really, and if here I am in the environmental consulting field and I don't know, then I'm sure everybody that's on the street, your neighbors and so forth, they need to be educated on this issue. Again, future generations are going to depend on us acting promptly on these issues.